Imagine this. You buy a small fruit tree, maybe an apple tree, a cherry tree, or a pear tree. You plant it carefully, water it every week, and eagerly await the day it starts to produce fruit. 2 years go by, then 3, and when summer finally arrives, the tree produces just a handful of fruit. Meanwhile, the tree keeps growing. The branches stretch towards the sky. It takes up more and more space in your garden, but the harvest remains minimal. And most people think that's normal, but it isn't. The truth is that most garden fruit trees produce very little because no one taught them something fundamental: how to direct the tree's energy towards the fruit instead of towards growth. The difference between a tree that produces just a few fruits and one that can fill several boxes each summer usually depends on a single practice: proper pruning. It's not just about cutting branches randomly. It's about understanding how the tree works and using pruning to redirect its energy. And when you do it right, the result can be surprising. Smaller trees, easier to harvest, and with 2 or even 3 times more fruit. In this video, we're going to look at 7 fruit trees that you should prune in January if you want to transform your garden into a truly productive system. Apple, pear, plum, cherry, peach, apricot, and quince trees. And we'll also see the simple system that farmers used for generations to turn common trees into real fruit factories. Because when you understand the tree's biology, pruning stops being a complicated task and becomes one of the most powerful tools to increase your harvest.
Now, knowing which trees to prune is only part of the story. What can really make a big difference in your harvest is understanding when and how to do it. And this is where a principle that many gardeners overlook comes in. Winter pruning and summer pruning have completely different effects on a fruit tree. Winter pruning is done when the tree is dormant, usually between January and late February, depending on the climate. At this time, the tree has stopped its growth, so it can better withstand the stress of pruning. The goal of this pruning is structural. It is used to remove dead wood, poorly placed branches, and to shape the tree so that it grows in a balanced way. But there's something important you should know. Winter pruning stimulates growth. When you remove branches in winter, the tree responds by producing new, vigorous shoots in spring to replace what it has lost. This is useful when you are forming the tree's structure during its early years. However, once the tree has reached the size you want, another tool comes into play: summer pruning. This is usually done in late summer, when the tree has already produced the season's growth. At this point, shortening the current year's shoots does not provoke strong new growth. Instead, the tree tends to redirect its energy toward forming structures that will produce flowers and fruit in the following season. That's why many traditional growers used a simple combination: shape the tree in winter and encourage fruit in summer. This system allows you to keep trees manageable and at the same time significantly increase production over the years. If we combine these 2 practices correctly, the result can be very different from what happens in most home gardens. A tree that is never pruned usually grows taller and denser each year. It produces many branches, many leaves, but relatively little fruit. In contrast, a tree that is pruned strategically maintains a strong and balanced structure. Light reaches all the branches, air circulates better through the foliage, and the tree can concentrate more energy on producing fruit instead of just growing. Over the years, this difference becomes very evident. A well-managed apple tree can produce several times more fruit than one that is never pruned. The same is true for pear, plum, or peach trees. The key is not to cut many branches at random. The key is to understand which branches to remove, when to do it, and how to guide the tree's growth. When you apply this system each season, you are building more than just a good harvest for the next summer. You are creating healthier, more manageable trees capable of producing fruit for many years. Because in the end, pruning a fruit tree isn't just about keeping the tree pretty. It's about turning it into a constant source of food. And it all starts with a few correct decisions each winter. So if you want to remember the complete system, it's quite simple. First, in late winter, when the tree is still dormant, you do the structural pruning. You remove deadwood, poorly positioned branches, and shape the tree so it receives good light and has a strong structure. Then, in late summer, you can perform a lighter pruning to control growth and encourage fruit production. 2 times a year, winter to shape the tree, summer to encourage fruit. When you consistently apply this system, the trees stay smaller, healthier, and much more productive. And over time, your garden stops being just a green space and becomes a real source of food. If you're interested in learning more about how to grow fruit trees, improve your garden, and produce more food at home, consider subscribing to the channel, because small changes in how we care for our plants can make a huge difference in the harvests we get each year.
This is where most gardeners make the same mistake. They plant a fruit tree and let it grow completely its own way. In nature, that makes sense. A wild tree tries to grow as tall as possible to compete for sunlight. The taller it grows, the more leaves it can produce, and the better its chances of survival. But that natural goal is not the same as yours. You don't want a gigantic tree that produces a few fruits at the very top where you can't even reach them. What you want is the exact opposite. A compact, easy-to-manage tree that concentrates its energy on producing abundant fruit each season. The problem is that if you don't intervene, the tree will always prioritize growth over fruit production. For the tree, growing means surviving. Fruit is just a way to reproduce. That's why many unpruned fruit trees end up becoming something that looks impressive from the outside, large, full of branches and leaves, but with very little fruit. And that's where pruning comes in. When you prune a tree correctly, you're not just removing branches, you're sending a biological signal to the tree. You're telling it where to grow, how to distribute its energy, and most importantly, when to produce fruit. A well-pruned tree can produce several times more fruit than a tree that grows unchecked. And this works because pruning completely changes the way the tree distributes its energy among 3 fundamental processes: growth, maintenance, and fruit production. When you understand this principle, pruning stops seeming like a complicated task. It becomes a way of directing the tree's behavior. And that is exactly what we are now going to apply to 7 of the most common fruit trees you can have in your garden.
The number 1 tree is the apple tree. If you only had space for one fruit tree in your garden, the apple tree would often be one of the best choices. Apples keep well for months, can be used in dozens of recipes, and apple trees respond better to pruning than almost any other temperate climate fruit tree. But there is a problem. An unpruned apple tree can quickly become a tall tree, full of long, messy branches with much of its fruit growing in hard-to-reach areas. This happens because the tree directs much of its energy into producing new wood instead of producing fruit. And the taller it grows, the harder it becomes to manage. That is why winter pruning is especially important for apple trees. When you prune an apple tree in January or late winter, while the tree is still dormant, you can control its structure from the beginning. The first step is to remove any dead, damaged, or diseased branches. These branches not only fail to produce fruit, but they can also become a gateway for diseases. Next, remove the branches that grow toward the inside of the tree. These branches usually receive very little light and create an overly dense structure that hinders air circulation. And a tree with poor air circulation is much more vulnerable to pests and diseases. Once you've removed those problematic branches, the next goal is to define the tree's structure. Many traditional growers prefer a pyramidal or Christmas tree shape. This means that the lower branches are slightly longer and the upper ones are shorter. This structure has several advantages. It allows light to reach all parts of the tree, it helps the branches better support the weight of the fruit, and it keeps the tree at a more manageable height. When you make the cuts, it is ideal to prune just above a bud that points in the direction you want the new branch to grow. If the bud points outward, the new growth will too, which helps keep the tree open and well lit. This small detail may seem insignificant, but it is one of the most important techniques for controlling the tree's shape over the years. A well-pruned apple tree not only produces more fruit, it also produces better quality fruit, larger, better lit, and much easier to harvest. And when you repeat this process every winter for the first few years of the tree's life, you are building a strong structure that can produce abundant harvests for decades. Tree number 2 is the pear tree. Pear trees are pruned in a very similar way to apple trees, but they have one important difference. They tend to grow more vigorously. This means that if you do not control them from the beginning, they can devote most of their energy to producing new wood instead of producing fruit. That is why, during the first few years, winter pruning on pear trees is usually a bit more aggressive. The goal is the same, to build a strong, well-distributed structure. First, dead, diseased, or damaged branches are removed. Then, branches that grow toward the inside of the tree or that cross with other branches are removed. This helps to keep the tree open, with good light penetration and air circulation. Once this is done, the tree's main structure is defined. As with apple trees, many growers prefer a pyramidal shape. This shape allows light to reach all branches and reduces the risk of branches breaking under the weight of the fruit. However, there is an important principle to remember with pear trees. The more you prune a tree in winter, the more growth it will produce the following spring. For this reason, once the tree reaches your desired size and shape, it is best to reduce winter pruning to a bare minimum. From that point on, the goal is no longer to control the tree's size, but to encourage fruit production.
Tree number 3 is the plum tree. Plum trees belong to what is known as stone fruits, and this means that their pruning requires a bit more care than that of apple or pear trees. The reason is that these trees are more susceptible to certain diseases that can enter through pruning cuts. That is why it is important to prune when the weather is dry and the tree is still dormant in late winter. The basic process remains very similar. First, dead, damaged, or diseased branches are removed. Then, branches that grow towards the interior of the tree or that cross with others are removed, as this creates overly dense areas where moisture can accumulate. But there is another important detail with plum trees. They tend to produce many vigorous shoots, known as suckers. These shoots usually grow straight and very fast, but they almost never produce fruit. If they are not removed, they end up stealing energy from the tree and reducing production. Therefore, it is advisable to remove these suckers from their base each winter. With regular pruning, the plum tree maintains a balanced structure, receives more light on all its branches, and can concentrate its energy on producing better quality fruit.
The 4th tree is the cherry tree. Cherry trees are also stone fruits, so they share some of the same precautions as plum trees when it comes to pruning. But they have another fairly common challenge. They grow very quickly upwards. A cherry tree left to grow unchecked can reach a considerable height in a few years, and much of the fruit ends up being produced at the very top of the tree. The result is a tree full of cherries, but out of your reach. That's why winter pruning on cherry trees usually focuses on controlling the height. Each year, the main leaders are shortened to keep the tree at a manageable size. Branches that grow inwards or create overly dense areas are also removed. This allows light to reach the center of the tree and improves air circulation. Good ventilation is especially important for cherry trees because it helps reduce fungal problems that can affect the leaves and the fruit. When an open and balanced structure is maintained, the cherry tree is not only easier to harvest, but also produces better quality fruit. Tree number 5 is the peach tree. Of all the fruit trees on this list, the peach tree is one that relies most heavily on good pruning to produce well. Unlike other trees, peach trees produce most of their fruit on the previous year's growth. This means that if the tree is not pruned correctly, many old branches stop being productive, and the harvest begins to decline over the years. That is why peach trees usually require a bit more active pruning. Each winter, old, weak, or poorly positioned branches are removed to stimulate the growth of new shoots that will produce fruit the following season. It is also important to keep the center of the tree relatively open so that light can reach all the branches. Sunlight is one of the most important factors for peaches to develop good size, color, and flavor. When the tree receives enough light and its growth is regularly renewed, the peach tree can produce very abundant harvests. Tree number 6 is the apricot tree. Apricot trees also belong to the group of stone fruits and, like peach trees, can be somewhat sensitive to diseases if not managed correctly. That is why pruning should be done carefully, first removing any branches that show signs of damage, disease, or weakness. Branches that cross or grow toward the interior of the tree should also be removed to maintain an open structure. This allows light to reach all parts of the tree and helps air to circulate better among the branches. Good ventilation is key to reducing the risk of fungal problems that can affect both the leaves and the fruit. Unlike other more vigorous fruit trees, apricot trees usually benefit from moderate pruning. The goal is not to cut too much, but to maintain a balanced structure that allows the tree to concentrate its energy on producing healthy, well-developed fruit. Tree number 7 is the quince. Although not as common as apple or pear trees, the quince is a very interesting fruit tree for home gardens. It is a relatively small, hardy tree capable of producing abundant harvests when well cared for. But unlike other more vigorous fruit trees, the quince does not require such intense pruning. In fact, pruning it too much can reduce the harvest. This happens because quinces usually produce their fruit on the tips of the previous year's growth. If you cut too many branches during the winter, you can remove much of the wood that was going to produce fruit the following season. Therefore, with quinces, pruning usually focuses mainly on removing dead wood, damaged branches, or those that grow towards the interior of the tree. The goal is to maintain an open and balanced structure without removing too much productive growth. With light and regular pruning, the quince can become a very reliable tree that produces fruit year after year.